We're back again with more pragmatics. Different topic today, but same book. I'm going to be talking about some communication pitfalls today. So, just forewarning, there's some jargon featured in this excerpt, and I can attempt to explain some of these concepts briefly afterward, but don't worry if you're not familiar with all of it, it's okay. And this excerpt's really only going to be sort of tangentially related to the topic, so hopefully you can follow along. Let's read the excerpt and we can go from there. Disagreement about how to punctuate the sequence of events is at the root of countless relationship struggles. Suppose a couple have a marital problem to which he contributes passive withdrawal, while her 50% is nagging criticism. In explaining their frustrations, the husband will state that withdrawal is his only defense against her nagging, while she will label this explanation a gross and willful distortion of what really happens in their marriage. Namely, that she is critical of him because of his passivity. Stripped of all ephemeral and fortuitous elements, their fights consist in a monotonous exchange of the messages, "I withdraw because you nag," and "I nag because you withdraw." The authors then go on to say, the problem lies primarily in an area already frequently mentioned: their inability to meta-communicate about the respective patterning of their interaction. This interaction is of an oscillatory yes, no, yes nature, which theoretically can go on ad infinitum, and almost invariably is accompanied, as we shall see later, by the typical charges of badness or madness. Alright. So, again, there's quite a bit of jargon there. You'll be forgiven if some of it is lost on you. But really the most important and relevant concept in terms of what we're going to be talking about today is this notion of punctuating a sequence of events, which is just really a fancy way of saying the point at which you determine the start of something, the sort of first cause, the A in the A, B, C. And that a lot of conflicts arise out of a disagreement about where to punctuate the sequence. Where was the first cause? Was it the nagging? Was it the passivity, for example? So, a common thing or pitfall I've observed when people are trying to communicate and they're trying to resolve a conflict is that they begin with a conclusion. For example, as stated in the excerpts, I nag because you're passive, or I do X because you nag. That's a conclusion. Now, the issue with starting with a conclusion like that is that you're limiting the options of the person you're talking to. They can really only respond in a couple of different ways. They can either agree with you, and then I suppose the conflict is over. There is no conflict. Or they can disagree. Now, if they disagree, you're at risk of entering a debate. Now, what's wrong with that? Well, debates, by their nature, are somewhat adversarial. There's a winner and a loser, there's a right and a wrong, correct, incorrect, and they're somewhat zero-sum because of that. Now, in certain contexts, that can be perfectly fine. If you're having an intellectual discussion and you have different views and you want to debate ideas, that can be great. It can be great fun to do that. But if this is someone you care about, and your interest is not simply just demonstrating your superior intelligence or knowledge, then this can end up harming you in the long run. And that even if you're right and the person concedes, you may end up harming the relationship. So, is there a better way? Because once you enter that frame, if there's a disagreement, then you're really just in a position where you're just presenting evidence to reinforce your perspective. And again, this can just escalate and become quite acrimonious and contentious. And even if someone concedes, you can end up feeling worse about each other in the end. So if that method is flawed, is there a different approach we can take? Well, yeah. What if, instead of a conclusion, you remain agnostic as to what has actually happened and what's bothering you? Well, how do you do that? Well, something that's difficult to disprove, unlike a conclusion, is simply your own feelings and what you observe. Now, again, the issue people have is that they leap from what they observe and feel, and then they attach a cause to it, typically another person, which just provokes their defenses, and then again you're in debate mode. But if you just stick with what you feel and observe, that's hard to be refuted. And the benefit of that, of just confessing your ignorance, that, you know, I noticed this thing and I felt kind of irritated, or this has just been bugging me. I don't fully know why. There may be a connection here, I don't know. So I thought it'd be worth bringing up, see if we can figure it out. Now compare that to starting a conversation with, you may be mad when you said this. You see how the former is far more inviting than the latter? And then again, with the latter, you either agree or you say, no, I didn't. That's not what I meant. Or I didn't say that. So the benefit of just throwing out some observations without attaching a conclusion to why these things are potentially related or why you felt that way, is that it invites the other person to, rather than being an adversary in the debate format, to being a collaborator, someone that can actually help you get to some better understanding of what happened. And by doing that, you can potentially foster a more robust foundation of whatever the relationship may be, whether it's a friend, family member, spouse, etc. So if starting with conclusions is not going too well for you, and you just keep getting into these debates that, even if you're right, end up leaving both parties feeling worse, then this is a potential option. And one other thing maybe to mention is that with the debate format stuff, often when people do that, it gets them to focus on the content of a dispute. And this is not really, this is something else that is another big fundamental concept that is discussed in the book that we didn't really touch upon, but just briefly, a lot of arguments get stuck on this content level. What do I mean by content? Well, just simply the sort of factual stuff. You know, you didn't do the dishes. Why not? Well, why would I want to do dishes? This kind of stuff I'm sure you've seen the movie I'm referencing. That's a beautiful portrayal of what I'm talking about. Maybe I can make a whole video on that. But the dispute is rarely about the content. People they're not mad because of dishes, or you didn't put the trash out, or whatever it is, this mundane stuff. It's rarely ever about that. It's what is interpreted, the message that is derived from that observation about the relationship as a whole. That's the other layer, the more fundamental layer. But if you get stuck on this content level, which is, again, what commonly happens when people just start with conclusions and then get into a debate, you're just, as they mentioned in the book, you're just in this cycle ad infinitum of just arguing back and forth your evidence. But you're stuck on this narrow thing that is not really getting at the more foundational issue, which is, what does the person believe that this action or inaction, whatever I have an issue with, says about how they feel about me and our relationship as a whole. And that ultimately is what meta-communication is, which is another jargon term that was referenced in the excerpt I shared, where you're communicating about how you communicate with each other, or what the content of what you're saying or doing says about how you actually feel about each other. But there's a lot there. I don't want to go too much off on a tangent. We can do a whole other video about that. So we'll just leave it there and just reiterate that if you're starting with conclusions, you're likely to get into a debate, probably not going to go well. So unless you don't really care about the person, other than just proving that you're right and they're wrong and making them look ignorant or stupid, this strategy is kind of flawed. So maybe you want to try this other option. And I'm sure if you've been on the receiving end of this kind of thing, you feel equally defensive. If someone just brings a conclusion to you, your first thing is to point out the flaws in their argument. So it sort of goes both ways. But anyway, let's leave it there, and we can pick it up next time. Thanks.